The Dead and the Dying, Act 2, written by Leon Hamilton, featuring voice talent from Olivia Steele, Geoff Sturtevant, Steve Taylor, Jesse Cornett, Erik Peabody, Paul J. Mcsorley, Beatles Fanise, Creepyface, Chillers and Thrillers, Silver's Scary Stories, Paunch Monster Studios, and Duchess of Darkness. Chapter 1. Saved. Sitting up, gasping for air, Beth rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the fog from her brain. There were bandages around her midsection, and her head was throbbing from a beast of a headache. She was in bed and had no idea where she was or how she'd gotten there. The last thing she remembered was driving through the intersection with Andrew riding next to her.
Drew? Where are you? Drew!
Wincing from the pain in her ribs, she threw the blanket off, then tried to get up. Legs wobbling underneath her, she struggled her way to the door, trying to ignore the pain from each step. She'd made it halfway across the room when the door swung open as Andrew entered, followed by an old man wearing a gray suit. Rushing to her side, Andrew helped his mother back to the bed, then hugged her and smiled as he pulled away.
I didn't think you were gonna wake up. Are you okay?
Seeing him instantly calmed her down. Letting out a sigh of relief, she nodded and then reached up to touch him on the cheek.
I'm a lot better now that I know you're okay. Where are we?
I think it's a church. The lady that saved us brought us here. This is Mr. McGilroy. He says we can stay as long as we want.
When she finally took a look at the man, Beth almost smirked. He looked like a real-life version of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. The only difference was Gilroy didn't have the hunched back and bad posture. Giving him a friendly smile, Beth relaxed a little.
Thank you for helping us. I don't know what we would have done without you.
Gilroy nodded and spoke up.
No need for thanks, my dear. This is the Lord's work we do here. What man of faith would deny salvation to those in need?
Something about him seemed wrong. There was a glimmer in his eyes that gave her a bad feeling. Maintaining her friendly smile, Beth thanked the man again, then asked if she could have a moment alone with Andrew. Once Gilroy was gone and the door was closed, she brought her finger up to her lips, signaling Andrew to stay quiet. The two of them sat listening to the old man's footsteps get further away. When they couldn't hear him anymore, Beth spoke in a hushed tone.
Are you okay?
Andrew nodded, and she continued.
Good. How'd we get here?
A lady in a blue truck saw me trying to get you out of the car, so she stopped to help. She was on her way here, so she brought us with her. I don't know her name, but she's in the main hall with the others.
Others? How many?
I don't know, but there's a lot of them. A couple came in last night, but I don't think anyone else is going to be able to get in.
Why? What happened? Wait, what do you mean last night? How long have we been here?
We got here a few days ago. I haven't been keeping up. No one else can get in because a car drove by with a bunch of zombies following it. When they couldn't keep up, they just sort of stopped. Now there's like 100 of them around the building.
Looking around the room, Beth tried to focus. They needed to get out of the city, but now that they didn't have a car, that was going to be tough. Before she could say anything about it, Andrew spoke up.
I think that Gilroy guy is watching me. Last night I couldn't sleep, so I went to the main hall. When I got ready to come back to the room, I saw him. He was standing on one of the balconies looking at me. I was tweaking for a second. I had to do a double take, but when I looked again, he was gone.
Why would he be watching you?
I don't know. I didn't do anything. I wasn't even here that long. Everyone was crying and freaking out, so I came back here.
Wincing and getting back to her feet, Beth made her way over to the window to look outside. They were on the second floor. A massive stone tower blocked most of the view, but glancing down to her left, the street was visible. Across the road, abandoned cars surrounded the gas station on the corner. The dead were everywhere, some shuffling, others crawling, but the ones that scared her the most were the runners. They were fast, strong, and vicious as hell. They'd seen more than a few attacks before the accident. The runners led the slow ones to the food, but now that there was none, they were attacking the crawlers. Beth watched as 3 runners piled on a morbidly obese crawler that had been lagging behind. They devoured him, leaving nothing but bones. Disgusted, Beth turned her attention back to Andrew.
I don't like it any more than you do, but we're stuck here. Even if those things weren't outside, we don't have a car.
Trailing off, Beth turned and looked out the window. There were at least 24 cars on the street, not to mention the 8 still parked at the pumps. Nodding to herself, she winced, then turned and limped over to the bed.
Go to the window and look at the gas station across the street.
Doing as he was told, Andrew took a look, then turned to his mother and shrugged. Taking a deep breath, Beth got silent for a second, choosing her next words wisely.
If I can get one of those cars, we could get back on the road. The problem is I'm hurt. If we go out there right now, I won't make it. We need to stay here long enough for me to heal. Once I'm back on my feet, we can go.
Nodding his head, Andrew agreed, then went wide-eyed as an idea struck him.
We still have our stuff. You could call Uncle Pat and ask him to come get us.
Instantly rejecting the plan, Beth shook her head.
He's got a family of his own to look after. We can't ask him to leave them. We're on our own here. Just give it a couple of days. If I'm not ready by then, we'll come up with something else. Till then, do what you can to avoid the old man and stay out of trouble.
Their conversation didn't go on much longer. After helping his mother into bed, Andrew left the room. His plan was to get her something to eat from the kitchen. A few of the people from the church had been giving out sandwiches, but most of the people in the chapel weren't eating, so he figured there'd be a lot left over. When he got to the main hall, he stopped just outside the doorway. It was a large circular room with balconies going all the way around on the second floor. The main floor was lined with long wooden benches divided into sections surrounding a stage, and on that stage stood Mr. Gilroy. He was telling everyone about the evacuation site being overrun by the dead. After calming the crowd, he launched into a rant about sin and evil deeds being the cause of all this. Using scriptures to reinforce his point, he finished his speech by saying,
"The meek shall inherit the earth, and we who have gathered here are the chosen few. Rejoice, brothers and sisters, for now is the time of new beginnings. Make no mistake, the road ahead will not be a kind one. There will be hard days and even harder choices, but together we shall overcome this obstacle. For now, eat and rest. All of you are welcome to stay. If there's anything you need, feel free to ask. Have a wonderful evening and bless you all. Good night."
With that, he ended his speech and exited the stage. Andrew watched the old man cross the room and stop to talk to a young couple standing near the kitchen. The conversation didn't last long. Gilroy motioned for the pair to follow him, and the 3 of them disappeared down a nearby hall. Once Andrew was sure the old man was gone, he hurried over to the tables where the food was set. It was the same as the night before: peanut butter sandwiches, an apple, and a bottle of water. As he gathered what he came for, The murmuring from the crowd became clear. Gilroy's speech had received a mixed response. While a lot of the crowd seemed to be on board, some of them were put off by the whole thing and were talking about leaving. Moving a little slower than necessary, Andrew overheard some guy in a trucker hat talking about a hunting lodge in Alaska. He said the cold would keep the dead away. Judging by the reaction from the people around him, they believed it. Nodding to himself, Andrew grabbed sandwiches and 2 bottles of water, then headed back to the room. When he got to the hall, he stopped and turned back. Looking around at everyone, he realized he didn't see the lady who had helped them after the wreck. He'd seen her the night before, arguing with one of the ladies that had been passing out the blankets. Shrugging it off, thinking she'd probably taken off on her own, he got back on track and took the food to his mother. Chapter 2. Homework. An ocean of the dead milled the streets as Jerry sat staring out the window. After witnessing the fall of the quick-stand evacuation site, he found himself trapped, with nowhere to go and no way to get there. He'd taken cover in a nearby apartment complex, less than a block from Ground Zero. On the upside, there was plenty of food in the apartment he'd picked, and there were 8 others that were empty. The set of units were the only ones in the complex with a lobby. Locking those doors had saved his life. Now, he was sitting in his own little compound. On the downside, there were zombies everywhere. In the first few hours, some of the horde spread out, disappearing into the neighborhood. The ones that couldn't follow the runners were now filling the streets, attacking anything living or being drawn away by distant noises. Taking his attention away from the window for the first time in hours, Jerry blinked and rubbed his eyes, then got up.
Oh, start early,
he muttered to himself as he stretched while looking around the apartment. He remembered reading somewhere that it was best to get a jump on things in a disaster situation. Waiting for your supplies to run out was a good way to make bad decisions. After taking an inventory of what he had, it was time to clean out the other apartments. Stepping out onto the shared walkway, Jerry quietly went over to the railing and took a look at the lobby entrance. The entire wall was made of glass, but it was mirror tinted, so he could see out, but no one could see in. He watched a pair of zombies shamble by on the sidewalk. When they turned and came towards the door, he almost panicked. For a second, he thought they'd seen him, but when they stopped and stared at their reflections, he relaxed. They stood there till a small group of people ran by, then they staggered off in hot pursuit. Confident he could pull this off without being seen, Jerry got to work. The first apartment smelled like cat piss and looked like it belonged to a hoarder. There were boxes stacked floor to ceiling, cluttering up most of the place. But when he got to the kitchen, it was worth it. Oddly enough, the kitchen looked like someone with OCD cleaned it. Everything was spotless and neatly arranged. The contrast between this room and the rest of the apartment was surreal. The pantry was stocked with canned food and dry goods like rice, beans, instant potatoes, noodles, and oats, all kept in labeled glass jars. Rather than attempt to move everything, Jerry loaded a box with the things he wanted, then made a list of what was there. Once he'd inventoried everything and dropped the first box off at his apartment, he moved on to the next. By the time he'd finished the second floor, he'd found more than enough food and water, but most importantly, a baseball bat. At first glance, it appeared to be a normal bat, but when he grabbed it, he was surprised. The thing felt like it weighed 20 pounds. After swinging it a few times, It was obvious he'd need practice using it. Putting the bat aside for the moment, he set his sights on the first floor. The first apartment near the bottom of the stairs was vacant and looked like it had been empty for a while. As he stepped out into the lobby, he flinched. One of the dead was standing just outside the window next to him. If it weren't for the glass, he'd be lunch. Sneering at the thought, Jerry stood silently watching the thing outside. It was a woman. She would have been pretty if the right side of her face hadn't been chewed off. As a matter of fact, the entire right side of her body had been shredded. Trying not to make any sudden moves, Jerry glanced over his shoulder at the street. More were coming. So far, all of them would stare at their reflection for a while, then leave, but he didn't want to risk it. Slowly turning and going back upstairs, he decided to save the first floor for later, when the coast was clear. The rest of the day was spent watching news reports and Googling information he thought he might need. Using a desktop computer and a printer he'd found in one of the apartments, he printed out how-to guides. Gardening, auto repair, water distillation, and anything else he thought might be useful was printed, stapled, and organized. When that was done, he used the last of the printer's ink to make maps of all the hardest hit areas. Every major city had been hit. The only areas with minimal exposure were small towns and mountain ranges. Staying in the city would be a nightmare on a good day, but for now, it would have to do. The streets were too active. Trying to leave right now would be a death sentence. In the end, his only choice was to stay put long enough for things to die down. Accepting the fact that this would be home for a while, he put everything away, then went back to the window. He watched the dead. Learning how they moved and interacted with each other felt important. The freshly turned moved fast. When they ran off, huge chunks of the horde would follow them. He couldn't tell if it was by design or if it was just their reaction to movement. The ones that were left behind broke down into a couple different categories. The slow, stupid ones that would aimlessly wander around looking for a meal. They weren't harmless, but they were pretty easy to avoid. Then there were some that weren't as fast as the runners, but they could move well enough to be a problem. There were always one or two bigger ones that acted as alphas leading the others. Lastly, there were the ones that had been so badly mangled that they couldn't walk or were just too slow to keep up. They would hide and wait for victims. Once a meal was close enough to grab, they'd snap into action. The one thing they all had in common was the fact that they didn't make noises unless food was near. It was unnerving to see them silently moving through the streets. Jerry could imagine turning a corner and suddenly finding himself facing a wall of the dead. On the upside, one thing that always gave them away was their smell. The stench of 1,000 people voiding their bowels was indescribable. That aroma would get worse as the body started to rot. A combination would be like an invisible punch to the face. Wincing at the thought of it, Jerry continued watching till the sun started to set. All he could see were stragglers, but there was no way the buildings were empty. The evacuation site had been set up at a local high school. The campus was massive and had been packed with military personnel. He figured if there were any survivors, they'd be in there. If no one made it, those buildings would be full of the dead. Either way, he wasn't going inside to check. Over the next few days, he fell into a routine. Every morning, he'd wake up, eat breakfast, then practice swinging the bat for an hour. After that, he'd shower, then use the internet to plan his escape routes out of the city. There was no point in checking the news. Every station was broadcasting the same set of instructions on a loop. The rest of the channels were either off air or recycling old programming. Time was ticking. It was just a matter of days before the lights went out. If he was going to stay, he needed to find a way to secure the building. There were only 2 main entrances, but the first-floor apartments had patio doors and windows he'd have to cover. Rather than risk exposing himself or making too much noise, he came up with a solution. Going door to door, he reversed all the locks and filled the keyholes with superglue. He was almost done when he ran into a problem. The last apartment was locked. He noticed it when he first checked the building. At the time, it wasn't an issue, but now that he was staying, he needed to know what was in there. Pressing his ear to the door and lightly knocking, Jerry listened intently. For the first few seconds, all he could hear was the slight hum of the air conditioner. Feeling certain there was no one inside, he stepped back to inspect the door. Getting it open without making noise was going to be a problem. As that thought crossed his mind, a shadow blocked out the light coming through the peephole. Realizing there was someone in there, Jerry stepped aside just in case they decided to shoot through the door. Staying calm and keeping his voice down, he introduced himself.
I don't want any trouble. My name's Jerry.
After a few seconds with no reply, he continued.
I don't know if you've noticed, but there's some serious shit going on outside. It's probably best to stay away from the windows and try not to make any noise. If you need anything, I'm upstairs in apartment 4.
Once again, there was no response, but rather than stick around, Jerry went on with his day. The plan was to collect the sandbags from barricades the military had set up. He'd go out and make sure the coast was clear, and start bringing them in 1 or 2 at a time. When it was done, the lobby would be locked down, and the only exit would be the rear door leading to the parking lot. With the game plan set, he rushed off to get ready. Putting on his armor felt strange. For a second, he imagined this is what it must have felt like to go to war. Strapping on his gun belt and grabbing the bat, he headed out. Stepping through those doors for the first time in days was a shock to the system. There were abandoned cars blocking the street and bodies everywhere. Most of the corpses had been too destroyed to reanimate. All that was left were piles of maggot-infested meat. The cars, on the other hand, were a completely different story. While a lot of them were empty, a good number of them contained zombies. They groaned and mashed their faces against the window as Jerry crept by, trying to stay quiet. After watching the dead for days, he thought he'd prepared himself for this, but a tan Ford Explorer proved him wrong. In the back seat, there were 2 dehydrated infants, still strapped in their carriers, that stopped him in his tracks. As if seeing them wasn't bad enough, the sound they made was haunting. Their cries were almost normal. If he wasn't looking at their pale little faces, he would have thought they were alive. Lost in the moment, he didn't notice the sound of shuffling feet approaching. It wasn't till a stooped-over corpse stepped around the front of the SUV that he snapped out of it. Jerry had been carrying the bat in his hand. All he had to do was change his stance, grip it, then let it rip. He'd practiced for this exact moment, and now that it was here, he felt like he was going to shit a brick. The guy in front of him was slow, missing his left arm and dragging a broken right leg that gave him an awkward shuffle. Locked in on his target, Jerry was about to swing when a mangled hand reached out from under the car and grabbed his ankle. Now faced with 2 enemies, he had to think fast. Snatching his leg free and repositioning himself, Jerry watched the zombie staggering toward him. For some reason, he couldn't stop looking at the stump of his left arm. It had been broken off at the elbow, and the nub had been chewed down to the bone. forcing himself to focus on his target. Jerry loaded up and swung away. His form was flawless. He practiced it every day. Powering through with his hips, he let it rip, and the result was devastation. The shot hit the zombie's head with so much force that one of its eyes popped and the other exploded in its socket. The impact also cracked its skull at an odd angle, causing some brain to mushroom out of the new opening as it fell. With no time to admire his work, Jerry set his sights on the second zombie. This one was in bad shape. If it weren't for the tattered remains of a dress, he wouldn't have known it was a woman. Her legs were missing, and her arms were a gnarled mess, but that wasn't stopping her. Looking at the trail of blood and skin she was leaving, Jerry let her crawl till she touched his boots. Sidestepping, then kicking her hard enough to flip her onto her back, Jerry sneered at the undead thing. She squirmed and groaned, trying to right herself, while he stared down at her. After an odd moment of silence, he looked around, making sure no more were coming. Seeing that the area was clear, he glared at her one last time, then caved her skull in with the bat and walked away. Chapter 3. Swimming Lessons. The trip to the harbor hadn't gone exactly as planned. Aside from having to navigate around abandoned cars and packs of zombies, Daniel picked up 2 passengers, a woman named Virginia and a little girl named Holly that had been held up in a car for 2 days when he found them. At first glance, he thought they were mother and daughter, or possibly sisters. But it turns out they didn't know each other. Virginia had been running through the traffic, trying to escape a horde that had flooded the area. She jumped in the first car with an unlocked door, and that's how they wound up together. Whoever Holly had been with never came back to the car, so Virginia took it upon herself to look after the girl. What was supposed to be an hour's drive took an entire day. After weaving their way through roadblocks and taking detours, they wound up in the City Hall building. The harbor was less than a block away, and the place had been secured by a small group of people. There were 5 survivors held up in the building: Marvin, Bruce, Zoe, Jill, and Pete. Marvin and Zoe both worked in the building as file clerks and were there when everything started. Bruce and Jill came from the surrounding neighborhood after escaping their homes. And last but not least, there was Pete. He'd come to the harbor with 2 of his buddies to steal a boat, but when they got there, all of them were gone. They wound up getting trapped by a pack of zombies. One of them, a guy called Slim, got bit and turned on the first night. Slim killed Rico, the other member of their group, and he escaped out of the bathroom window. From there, he made his way to the City Hall building and had been there ever since. No one seemed to be in charge. As a matter of fact, most of them were planning on leaving. The only reason they were there was because they didn't have a ride. When Daniel offered up his car, all hell broke loose. Bruce didn't trust Marvin. Jill didn't like Bruce, and Zoe didn't want to leave. Pete, on the other hand, wasn't involved. He sat off to the side, smoking a cigarette and watching them argue. When Virginia and Holly left to find the restrooms, Daniel rolled over to Pete and gave him a nod.
What's going on in here? Why are they acting like that?
Pete chuckled.
They're fucked up. This shit's got them all twisted. The chick with the glasses swears she caught the creep with the comb over watching her get dressed. She says he was beating his meat and staring at her from around the corner.
He paused, laughing to himself and taking another drag before going on.
Marvin over there's been acting weirder than usual. He's been sneaking off and coming back late at night. Bruce thinks he's planning something. I figure he's looking for a way out, but you never know. He seems like the disgruntled employee type to me. The old lady doesn't want to leave because she's scared shitless. Hell, we all are, but she'd rather starve to death in here than get eaten out there.
Taking it all in, Daniel nodded to himself, then asked,
What about you?
After one last drag of a cigarette, Pete thumped the butt away and exhaled the smoke.
Oh, don't you worry about me. My brothers know where I'm at. As soon as they get here, I'm riding out. What about you and that prime cut you walked in with? You two planning on setting up shop and playing house?
Shaking his head and looking around, Daniel shrugged.
Not really. I'm supposed to be meeting someone here, but it might take a while.
Pete flashed a quick smirk and raised an eyebrow.
I noticed you said I and not we. I take that to mean the girls ain't part of the plan. Who are they to you?
The look in his eye was an instant red flag. Without flinching, Daniel replied,
I haven't told them about it. I didn't want to get their hopes up. If things don't work out, I don't want them to give up if we have to keep moving.
Giving an approving nod, Pete got up from his seat and stretched.
Smart move. If you're planning on being here a while, you might want to start thinking about food. I wasn't joking when I said starve in here. There's nothing to eat. That's the real reason they want to get out of here.
With that, he patted Daniel on the shoulder and walked away as Virginia and Holly came walking over. Glancing at the group, then back to Daniel, Virginia shook her head.
What happened? Why are they arguing?
After explaining the situation, Daniel pulled her aside.
Here's the deal. I'm supposed to be meeting someone at the harbor in a couple of weeks, and there's no food here. The supplies I have might last a week or two, but after that...
Before he could finish talking, the lights went out, plunging the city into darkness. Everyone stopped talking as the sound of a dying city crept in. The crackle of distant gunfire bounced off the walls, highlighting another sound that had gone unnoticed. At first, it was hard to make out. A dull thudding slowly became audible as someone in the group clicked on a flashlight.
Does anyone else hear that?
Bruce called out.
On it!
Pete replied, using the flashlight on his phone to guide the way. He wasn't gone long.
We're fucked. There's a bunch of those things pressed up against the doors.
Then Zoe blurted out.
It's their fault. Those things followed them here. We never should have let them in. They should have to go out there and deal with it.
In that instant, all eyes were on Daniel, Virginia, and Holly. Stepping up and pointing at Zoe, Virginia replied,
Eat shit, you old bitch. We didn't ask to be taken in. You invited us.
That outburst kicked off a war of words that went in circles till Jill finally made the point that none of it mattered. Blaming each other wasn't going to change the fact that there were zombies at the door. When everything died down, the group managed to come up with a plan. Going out there guns blazing would do more harm than good. The noise would attract more zombies, and they probably wouldn't kill enough of them to make a difference. That only left them with two options: abandon the place or lead the zombies away. Since abandoning the place would probably lead to most of them dying, they chose the only option they had left. Leading zombies away would be tricky. They'd have to find a way to trap them or get rid of them for good. Bruce suggested leading them to the pier. He thought if they could get the zombies into the water, they would either sink or float away. It wasn't a bad idea, and when Jill mentioned the house near the building had boat ramps, it got better. From the back of the building, the ramps were so close they could see into the water. The only thing standing in the way was a chain-link fence. Marvin solved that problem with a pair of bolt cutters from the janitor's office. With all pieces in play, it was time to pick roles. Since Zoe blamed Daniel, Virginia, and Holly for the problem, Daniel and Virginia would be the bait. They'd run around the side of the building and come up behind the zombies. They had to make enough noise to get their attention, then lead them to the trap. Marvin and Jill would cut the gate and be back in the building before Daniel and Virginia got there. When they made it to the hole, all they had to do was dive into the water and make noise till the zombies started falling in. Once the dead hit the water, Daniel and Virginia would swim to the closest ramp and get out. From there, they would have to go around 1 or 2 houses to get back to the building. Pete and Bruce would be taking out the stragglers, while Zoe kept an eye on Holly. On paper, it seemed like a solid plan. Now, it was time to see if it actually worked. Daniel and Virginia stood by the rear exit, nervously watching Marvin and Jill make their way to the fence. There were no zombies on this side of the building, so getting there was easy. When Marv started cutting the fence, the sound made everyone pause. Once they were sure they hadn't been spotted, Jill held the fence to stop it from rattling, and Marvin got back to cutting. Since Jill couldn't be the lookout anymore, Daniel and Virginia took up the slack and stepped out. Heart racing, hands shaking, Daniel glanced over at Virginia.
Do you think this is gonna work?
Turning to look at him, she flashed a nervous smile.
Not really. But if we're gonna die, we might as well go for a swim first.
As scared as he was, Daniel managed to chuckle, then looked back to see Marvin making the last cut. When they were done, the opening was ready. Virginia nodded at him, then they headed to the front of the building. The walk up the driveway felt like it was taking too long. When they had made the plan, they hadn't thought about the actual distance they'd have to run. Looking back at the hole in the fence, Daniel frowned. This wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. A lot could go wrong. One misstep, and they could both be lunch. Trying not to think about it, he got focused. When they reached the end of the driveway and turned, both of them froze. The dead were everywhere. The noise from the ones pounding on the doors was drawing in more from the neighborhood. Silently watching for a moment and pulling the revolver from his coat pocket, Daniel asked,
Are you ready?
Wide-eyed, staring at the crowd, Virginia absently replied.
No.
Raising the gun in the air, aiming at the sky, Daniel muttered,
Me neither.
Then fired a shot. The reaction was instant. Every dead-eyed freak on the street turned and headed their way. The bulk of the horde was slow, but there were a few runners cutting through the crowd. Making a break for it, Daniel and Virginia darted down the driveway, focused on the fence. For a brief moment, the world around them melted away with the rhythm of their footsteps. There was no horde, no chaos. There was just that moment and Daniel. For the first time in days, it almost felt normal. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. The raspy breathing of the zombies on their tails snapped them back to reality. The hole was just a few feet away now. They were cutting through the grass and airborne in no time. In that second between flying and falling, everything slowed down. But when they hit the water, the world went into overdrive. One of the zombies had been closer than they'd realized. When they went into the water, it had nearly come down on top of them. Virginia resurfaced first and was far enough away that she'd been out of its reach. Daniel, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. As he breached the surface, the dead thing grabbed him, pulling him back under. He flailed his arms and kicked his legs, fighting to break the ghoul's grasp, but it wouldn't let go. It clawed at his back, gripping fistfuls of Daniel's jacket, pulling him down as it sank. When Virginia turned to look back, she froze. Daniel wasn't there, and the dead were falling in. Taking a deep breath and going under, she tried to spot him. The commotion was stirring up the sediment and clouding the water, but she caught a glimpse of him struggling with one of the dead. Pushing off as hard as she could, Virginia swam down, praying she didn't run out of air. She wasn't the best swimmer, but she knew enough not to drown. As she got closer, she saw the problem. The zombie had Daniel by the hood of his hoodie, and he couldn't get free. The moment she was close enough to touch him, she grabbed the only thing available, his ankle. Because the zombie grabbed him by the hood, Daniel found himself upside down, fighting for his life. There was no cathartic moment of acceptance. He didn't want to die, and he was going to do everything in his power to prove it. Pulling with everything he had left, Daniel tugged his shoulder free, but as he attempted to right himself, he felt hands gripping his ankle. In the heat of the moment, his reaction was to kick as hard as he could. He felt his heel connect with something solid, and the hands let go. He was free. Swimming as hard as he could, Daniel streaked towards the surface and broke through, gasping.